You know that person who bursts out of the gate with unstoppable energy? They sign up for the gym, start a new project, dive into a relationship, or launch a side hustle with fireworks. And then, weeks later, it fizzles. The gym membership gathers dust, the project stalls, the relationship cools, the side hustle disappears. From the outside, it looks like laziness or lack of discipline, but psychology says otherwise. People who start strong but lose interest fast often have a very specific mindset, one that's both powerful and paradoxical. Let's start with the obvious. The initial burst of energy comes from dopamine-driven anticipation. Neuroscience shows that the brain's reward system lights up more during the anticipation of success than during the actual achievement. Starting feels thrilling because the brain is flooded with dopamine, but once the novelty wears off, the chemical rush fades, and so does motivation. These individuals aren't failing. Their brains are simply wired to crave beginnings more than middles. Here's the paradox. People who lose interest quickly often score higher in openness to experience. They're curious, adventurous, and drawn to novelty. That's why they start so many things. They genuinely love exploring. But the same trait that makes them great starters also makes them restless finishers. Once the exploration phase ends, the routine feels suffocating. Their brain craves the next spark, not the grind. But let's complicate this. Some of these individuals aren't just chasing novelty, they're chasing identity. Psychologists call this possible selves theory, the idea that we're motivated by visions of who we could become. Starting something new feels like stepping into a new version of yourself. But when reality doesn't match the fantasy, when the gym feels harder than imagined, when the project requires tedious details, the gap between the possible self and the actual self creates disillusionment. And that's when interest fades. Now, here's something fascinating. People who start strong but lose interest fast often have high sensitivity to reward but low sensitivity to punishment. They're motivated by excitement, not fear. They'll chase the thrill of a new idea, but they won't stick around just to avoid failure. This makes them bold experimenters but inconsistent finishers. And ironically, that inconsistency is what often fuels their creativity. They leave trails of half-finished projects, but those fragments can spark breakthroughs later. And let's be honest, society doesn't celebrate dabblers. It celebrates finishers. The completed book, the marathon medal, the successful startup. But dabblers, the ones who start strong and fade, are often the ones who generate the most ideas. They're the ones who see possibilities others miss. Their psychology isn't about weakness. It's about breadth. They trade depth for variety, and that trade-off has its own kind of brilliance. Let's zoom out. Why does this pattern, bursting with energy, then fading, feel so frustrating to others? Because culturally, we glorify persistence. We celebrate finishers, the marathon runner, the entrepreneur who sticks it out, the artist who completes the masterpiece. But psychology suggests that people who start strong and lose interest fast aren't failures. They're operating with a rare mindset that values possibility over permanence. Here's the paradox. These individuals often have dopamine systems tuned to novelty. Neuroscience research shows that dopamine spikes most intensely during the anticipation of reward, not the reward itself. That means the thrill of starting is chemically more satisfying than finishing. Once the novelty fades, the brain stops rewarding them and interest collapses. It's not laziness, it's neurobiology. Their brains are wired to chase beginnings, not endings. But let's complicate this. People who lose interest fast often score higher in divergent thinking, the ability to generate multiple ideas and solutions. They're natural innovators, they see possibilities others miss. But divergent thinking comes at a cost. It resists closure. Finishing requires convergent thinking, narrowing down, committing, completing. For them, narrowing feels like suffocation. So, they abandon projects not because they lack ability, but because their creativity thrives in expansion, not contraction. And here's something fascinating. Psychologists studying self-determination theory note that motivation comes in two forms: intrinsic, driven by curiosity, passion, and extrinsic, driven by rewards, recognition. People who start strong often lean heavily on intrinsic motivation. They begin projects out of genuine excitement. But when external demands, deadlines, routines, expectations take over, the spark dies. Their psychology resists turning play into obligation. Now, let's talk about relationships. This mindset doesn't just apply to hobbies or work. It shows up in human connections too. Some people enter relationships with intensity, grand gestures, deep conversations, endless enthusiasm. But as the novelty fades, they disengage. It's not that they don't care. It's that their brain craves the feeling of discovery more than the stability of routine. This can make them appear inconsistent, but in reality, they're chasing emotional novelty the same way they chase intellectual novelty. Here's the cultural paradox. In modern society, we equate consistency with virtue. But historically, dabblers, the ones who start strong and move on, were often the ones who sparked revolutions. Thinkers, inventors, artists who left trails of unfinished experiments that later inspired breakthroughs. Their psychology isn't about weakness. It's about exploration. They trade depth for breadth, and that trade-off has its own kind of brilliance. But let's be honest, there's a shadow side. Constantly losing interest can create frustration, guilt, and even identity confusion. Psychologists call this possible selves overload, when you imagine too many versions of yourself and struggle to commit to one. The gym goer, the entrepreneur, the artist, the traveler. Each unfinished project feels like a self-abandoned, and that can weigh heavily, creating cycles of self-doubt. Yet here's the beauty. People who start strong but fade often develop adaptive resilience. Because they've tried so many things, they're less afraid of failure. They know beginnings matter as much as endings. They know exploration has value even without completion. And that mindset, embracing the unfinished, can be liberating. It reframes life not as a checklist, but as a series of experiments. So maybe the psychology of people who lose interest fast isn't about weakness at all. Maybe it's about living with curiosity. They're not broken, they're explorers. They're not failing, they're sampling. And in a world obsessed with finishing, maybe the rarest mindset of all is the one that finds meaning in beginnings, even if the ending never comes.